I began watching and admiring the YouTube videos of many outspoken, eloquent, and well-informed atheists about a decade ago, and started the Atheist Codger's YouTube channel a few years later when, somewhat late to the party, I discovered my ability to make simple videos with my limited, antiquated computer and primitive video making skills, along with the easy accessibility of an online venue for the publication of those videos, and thought to toss my own hat into an already impressively populated arena with a few insights of my own. I began with a few opinion pieces and not long afterward took up the project of reading the entire Bible in video format. My motivation for doing that was the aggravating knowledge that my siblings, now in their 60s, along with their multitudinous descendants, still regarded the Bible as the infallible Word of God, just as I had during my teenage years, reared as I was in a sewer of evangelical fundamentalist Christianity, and still read it the same way to the extent that they read it at all, which is very selectively, with their understanding of what it says already laid out for them by their preacher man and Sunday school teachers. I'm the only one in that family who's ever managed the break from that awful prison, and I can attest to how protracted and punishing a journey that was, and admit to a certain amount of sympathy toward my siblings and the fruit of their loins for being unable to make that break, if it even occurred to any of them to make the attempt. After all, we have no control over the circumstances we're born into, nor who our role models and figures of authority were during childhood, nor any of the lies they taught us. None of us chose any of that. One of the things that helped me on my journey of liberation was actually, for the first time in my life, reading the Bible carefully, looking honestly at what it says rather than what I was taught to believe that it says, and thinking critically about what I was reading. I soon, and easily enough, discovered that it's a compendium of credulity-straining fairy tales and gut-wrenching horrors. I came to understand that if anyone honestly reads the damn thing, there's no way you can sustain the delusion that it represents the word of some deity. But, fascinated as I was and am by what a dark and enduring shadow that vile book has cast over American culture, I continued to read it, asking myself at every turn if it's really possible that any adult of sound mind actually believes in a talking snake, or a wrathful global flood, or fire falling from heaven to consume wicked cities or sacrificial offerings, or a reluctant prophet living for 3 days in the belly of a whale before being puked up unharmed onto dry land. More importantly, I had to wonder if all those genocidal horrors and ghastly directives in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, the books of Samuel and of the Kings could possibly be considered the righteous judgments of a God whom the New Testament declares on occasion to be loving. The conclusion I was driven to is that people who claim to believe such things don't actually believe them, or they're so psychologically warped and damaged that there's no hope of ever reaching them, and that they represent a clear and present danger to civilization. Is that last bit hyperbolic, considering that they voted in overwhelming numbers for the most absurd, unqualified, dangerous president in U.S. history and continue to support and enable him? There are any number of highly visible and virulently hateful preachers, ministers of the gospel they imagine themselves to be, who preach death to people whose sexual orientation is different from their own, or people whose skin color is darker than theirs, or whose politics don't line up with those of the haters, or those who are unwilling or unable to buy into their nutty beliefs and are thus destined for an eternity of unspeakable conscious torment for believing the wrong things. So I quixotically imagined that if I could read the Bible aloud and some of those like my family would listen, maybe they'd actually hear what's written there for the first time in their lives and the scales would fall from their eyes. How absurdly optimistic I was. I'm sorry to report that I saw no progress whatsoever on that front, but was regularly rewarded for my efforts with a flood of hateful comments. So, after having read almost 2/3 of the sacred scriptures aloud for a YouTube audience, including those long lists of unpronounceable names of Old Testament patriarchs, I abandoned the project. I've long since removed those early efforts from YouTube, along with the opinion pieces that I wrote that were aimed at the absurdities of fundamentalist Christian belief, and have since that time devoted my energies almost exclusively to the explication of music. But lately I've found myself thinking that maybe I'm not quite done there yet. So I'm going to take up the project again, but with a different slant. I'm going to present a series of Sunday school lessons, just one per week, addressing a number of concerns that continue to keep me awake at night. In those lessons, I'll cite that very Bible that was the only book ever opened in the Sunday school classes I attended as a child and a young teenager. This is the first of those lessons, and perhaps surprisingly, it is aimed not at Christians exclusively, but at my fellow atheists as well. I'll start with the atheists. Over the past few months, I've gradually withdrawn from a number of Facebook groups intended for conversation among atheists. My reason for joining them in the first place was to find a like-minded community and enlarge my understanding, and perhaps to recognize errors in my thinking and correct them. But increasingly, I found all too many of my fellow atheists to be as sweeping and unthinking in their judgments as any of the Christians I grew up around, and I found that increasingly disturbing. Just this past week, I left a group in which one of the discussion threads was headed by a post asking whether racist Christians imagine that non-whites will be admitted to heaven, or if they are, if they'll be granted the same privileges afforded to white people. It's kind of an interesting question, seeing that I grew up around racist Christians who wanted nothing whatsoever to do with anyone not like them, who considered non-whites to be inferior, even cursed by God, and with what they imagined to be biblical justification. An interesting question to contemplate. But instead of contemplating it, a number of the participants immediately declared that all Christians are racists, thereby indicating that the topic of conversation contains a redundancy. Of course, I bristled at that. I don't believe for one moment that Dr. Cornel West has a racist bone in his body, and said so, indicating that I also know a good number of white Christians who are simply incapable of racist sympathies. Those Christians are among the finest, most decent people I know. And one of the more hostile of the atheists in the group immediately charged me with bigotry. I demanded an explanation of that charge and never received one. But I'm certainly not going to tolerate that. And after waiting 6 hours for the reply that never came, I left the group without another word. I did not indulge in the homily that formed itself in my mind, because I'm pretty sure the person it would have been aimed at would never have read it, or, to judge from some of his other posts, understood it if he did read it. So this Sunday school lesson will address that very problem. And for the first half of the first in this series of lessons, atheists may consider themselves my target audience. A few hours after I left that group, I composed a short 2-part essay and posted it to my Facebook wall for the prayerful consideration of anyone who might be interested. I began with a plea to Christians, but did not leave it at that. Here's the first part. Christians, atheists, are not your enemy. I'm probably posting this in the wrong place. I have many Christian friends here, and I think every one of them already understands what I just said. But since I've left all the theist-atheist discussion groups I once haunted on Facebook, I don't have anywhere else to post it, and I know from long experience that a good many Christians think precisely that, and was just today reminded of it unexpectedly and to my usual chagrin. and need to hear atheists say this over and over until they get it. If some of my Christian friends could help me get the word out, I'd appreciate it. And so would a lot of other atheists who are just as sick and tired of being demonized as I am. We're going to hear a lot more of this during the run-up to the November election. And the more I hear of it, the more I want to withdraw into that cloistered condition that's gotten increasingly inviting year after year. As I indicated, that's just the first part. Here's the follow-up addressed to atheists. Atheists, not all Christians, are hateful ignoramuses. A good many are, but some atheists I know need to stop tarring with such a broad brush, and for that matter, I know atheists who can be hateful dicks. If you felt a flush of discomfort when I said that, then perhaps you're one of them. I have to admit, having been there, after all, the Bible contains a great deal of support for slavery, and it's easy to conflate the religion and the people, just as the obverse is true. At this point, I'm omitting the account of that day's encounter on Facebook that I've already described here. This was my conclusion. I want to think we atheists can do better than this, that we can show a still skeptical world that leaving religion is not a damnable apostasy, it's liberation. And liberated people tend to want the same liberty for others, want the same kind of fairness extended to all people, whether they're religious or not. That's one of the greatest benefits of leaving religion, to realize that you're no longer bound by hateful doctrines thousands of years old, doctrines that promote racism and misogyny and homophobia and abject submission to authority, but are free to be the fair, cooperative, moral, and empathic beings that our evolution as a social species equipped us to be. We can shine some light in some awfully dark crevices if we'll just try to stay fair about it. For many years, I've heard atheists argue persuasively that, its claims to the contrary, religion tends to place obstacles in the path of moral behavior rather than being an avenue to that end. It's easy enough to support that argument. Just look at the hate-filled sermons of Leviticus-loving Pastor Stephen Anderson of the New Testament Fundamentalist Baptist movement, a cult very much like the one I grew up in, who believes that homosexuals should be executed for capital crimes and that women should be subservient in all respects to men, and who can quote you chapter and verse to support his hateful views. His comrades are, unfortunately, legion, and so are his followers. For anyone who's committed to the notion that the Bible is the divinely given instruction book for life, such biblical teachings are unquestionably an impediment to moral judgments and behavior, just as other biblical claims are an obstacle to a scientific understanding of what the world is, who we are, and how we came to be. With a wide majority of Republicans in this country, most of them claiming to be born-again Christians, denying anthropogenic climate change and swallowing conspiracy theories whole, I don't see how such biblical teachings can be seen as anything other than a cursed liability to any society that embraces or even tolerates them. I'm not surprised when I hear such people level unsupportable charges against atheists. How many times, I wonder, have I been informed by members of my own family that the only reason I adopted atheism, the religion of atheism, is to avoid accountability for my sinful ways? The religion of atheism, as if that made a damn bit of sense. So yes, I do agree that religion can be and often is an impediment to morality and good judgment, and I don't deny a powerful anti-theistic impulse in me. I am now, after decades of struggle against an internal enemy, a far more decent person than I ever was when I was a Christian, and I long for an imagined day in the far distant future when the human species finally has the good judgment to abandon those fantasies and convert their churches, mosques, and temples into housing for the homeless, and food pantries and food kitchens and shelters for battered children and women, knowing full well, of course, that I'll never see that day. nor will our species. I suppose it's my own version of the hoped-for millennium. But to judge from some of the hateful pronouncements I see leveled by atheists against believers, I know that it will take far more than the disappearance of religion to cure what ails us naked apes. It will take empathy and understanding, and those can be nurtured in either a religious or non-religious context. It would no doubt improve things in general if no one had the devil to blame for their misdeeds or a God from whom to seek absolution, but it's no guarantee of moral maturity. Since, as I indicated, I'll be using the Bible as my reference text for these Sunday school lessons, today I'll cite a passage from that anthology of Jesus' sayings collected in 3 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount. I'll begin by acknowledging that there's a lot of nonsense and really bad advice in those 3 chapters, but there is, here and there, a thought-provoking gem among them. The one I'll focus on today lies at the beginning of chapter 7. All my readings, incidentally, will come from the New Revised Standard Version published by Oxford University Press. Here's the passage. Do not judge so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Luke's version of these sayings is considerably abbreviated compared to Matthew's and includes some interesting variants, but this particular teaching appears in practically identical form in both. The Atheist Codger's distillation of this passage is quite simple. Whether you are Christian or atheist or some other alternative, don't hold others to a standard that you yourself do not meet or are not willing to try. Atheists, if you resent the sweeping judgments made of us by Christians of the most narrow judgmental sort, then don't you be guilty of making similar judgments of all Christians. And Christians, don't tar everyone who holds opinions different from your own with the same broad brush. I find it easy to make common cause with any number of Christians on any number of things that actually matter. So please don't assume that I necessarily agree with all other atheists in any matter other than the rather trivial thing we have in common, that none of us believe in gods, yours or anyone else's. I don't know that there's a thing I need to add, so I'll see you next Sunday if you'd like to come along for this ride.